This class is going to focus on U.S. federal statutes. So during the class, we ask that you submit your questions using the chat feature. If the chat feature isn't open on your screen, look down at the row of buttons at the bottom of your WebEx window and click on the button that looks like a little cartoon talk bubble. Then you should start seeing the chat window on your right-hand side. If you're having trouble with your computer audio during the program, we suggest using the call-in feature. To find this feature, use a button that looks like 3 dots, which is the button for more options at the bottom of your window, and select switch audio or audio connection. After the webinar, if you're interested in the slides from the program, you should email us at askalibrarianonline. I don't think we're actually going to do an upload today. So if you want the slides, just send us a quick note on Ask a Librarian at ask.loc.gov/law, and we'll send them to you right away. All right. As I said before during the mic check, my name is Beth Osborne. I'm a reference librarian at the Law Library of Congress. The topic for today's class is legislative and statutory research, otherwise known as U.S. federal statutes. This will be an introductory level class on the topic of federal statutes. We're going to be together for an hour from 11 to 12. We'll go through a series of slides and practice what you've learned with a sample problem along the way. You can submit questions as you think of them in the chat box, and if I see them coming through, I'll try to answer them during class. But usually what happens is I'm kind of focused on giving a lecture, and then at the end of class, I go back through chat and try to get to the questions that were asked if I didn't get to them. So don't worry if I don't get to your question. I have a little bit of room at the end for some audience questions. You should have received a reminder email today about the class, and the reminder email included a copy of the sample problem that I'll be doing for you during class. So as I just mentioned, this class will cover federal statutes, which are the laws that are created by the United States Congress. Laws start as bills and resolutions that a member of Congress proposes should be a law, and this is called the legislative process. Once that bill or resolution is enacted, it's referred to as a statute, okay? Statutes are published in 2 different print publications. The U.S. Code, United States Code, which is probably what we're all the most familiar with, and something called the U.S. Statutes at Large. And we're going to discuss these different phases of a statute during class. Understanding where they're published helps you understand where to look for them and why when you're doing this type of research. One thing to keep in mind as we go through the class, each of the 3 branches of our federal government creates law. The legislature, Congress, right, creates statutes. The executive branch creates rules and regulations. And the courts create case law decisions. This class focuses on the law coming from our legislative branch, coming from Congress. I'll just briefly mention that the other classes in this series focus on law coming from the other 2 branches. And if you're interested in taking all 3 branches, they kind of fit together. Just visit our website where you probably signed up for this class, law.gov, and use a link for the Legal Institute. So we're going to come back to this graphic a couple of different times during the lecture. And each time we'll be introducing a new phase of our discussion. So right now you see a broad overview of the 3-part publication process from the time a law is enacted, or what's referred to as an enrolled bill, to the time it's inserted into the U.S. Code. So we'll discuss all these parts individually during the class, starting with the code, probably because it's the most familiar, and then working backwards. So we start at the top, and then we're going to go all the way down to enrolled bill. So like I said, we're going to use this graphic to kind of introduce each part. So right now I'm about to start talking about the U.S. Code, okay? The U.S. Code, United States Code, is the compilation of general and permanent federal laws, United States, organized by topic. It's built on the basis of 54 broad subjects. Each subject is assigned its own title number, okay? So for example, the laws pertaining to agriculture are in Title 7, and education laws are in Title 20. The titles are arranged hierarchically, so the general provisions on the subject come before more specific ones. Within a title, first is typically divided into chapters, and then those chapters are divided into sections, each time getting narrower and narrower. The code is organized in a way so that any new laws or amendments to existing laws are integrated into the code, and any repealed laws are eliminated from the code. And the code has this big index at the end, a multi-volume index that you can use if you don't really know what you're looking for, but you know a subject or a keyword or a concept. There's two different print sources of the U.S. Code. There's an official print version of the code, which is published by the Government Publishing Office, GPO, every 6 years, and updated every year with supplements. It's a big kind of hardback bound volume. And then there's also unofficial versions of the code. And maybe you're thinking, like, why would I use an unofficial version if there's an official version? Well, there's a couple of good reasons. The unofficial versions add more content, and especially these very helpful notes called annotations that provide summaries of cases applying or interpreting that statute. And they give you citations to secondary sources that analyze the law. So there's a lot of extra great information in these unofficial codes. And that's why they're also called annotated codes. Second, unofficial codes that are published by third parties, not GPO, they're updated more frequently than the official government version. The unofficial versions are usually updated each month with something called a supplement. And then in addition to those supplements, they're usually updated annually with something called pocket parts. Those pocket parts get inserted into the back of the book, and they'll give you any updates that happen to the text in whatever that pocket part is covering. The unofficial codes are published by private vendors. There's one called the United States Code Service. We call that U.S.C.S., and it's published by Lexis. And then there's also the United States Code Annotated, U.S.C.A., and that's published by West. Lexis and West are two of the pretty much the biggest legal publishers in the United States. I talked a little bit about the index before, but there's also some other very useful aids for finding what you need to find in the U.S. Code. And the print versions of the code are usually where you go to find these aids that help you navigate the text. If you only know the popular name of the act, and it's like, for example, all you know is that you need to find Megan's Law. All you know is the name of the law. You can use the popular name table to find out where that law has been inserted into the code just based on that name. So you don't need to know a number, a date, a bill, or anything like that. Second, if all you know is the original public law number, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, you can use what's called the Statutes at Large conversion table to find where that law was inserted into the code. So again, the print versions have these very nice, useful finding aids for, when you only know one part of the information getting you to where you need to be. And again, like we talked about a couple slides back, if all you know is the subject of the law or some keywords, there's a general subject index to all these print versions. And what we've done here with this slide is give you some information about where to find the U.S. Code online. So I've been talking about the print version, right? Librarians love books, but of course, most of us are accessing it online nowadays, right? So there's three free sources that we talk about in this class. There's the Office of the Law Revision Council's website, and that goes from 1994 to the present. There's GPO's website, govinfo, also goes from 1994 to the present. And then there's the Law Library of Congress's collection. That's more like a historical collection to fill the gap between the time when the code was first published, 1925, up through 1994. GPO's site has authenticated PDF versions of the print code. So when you need to see the pages exactly as they are in the printed version, that's what you would use. And the Office of the Law Revision Council's website is more HTML based. Okay, it's not PDFs, it's not scans of the pages. For most daily work and for searchability, I think the Office of the Law Revision Council's website is the best. It's updated the fastest, it's really easy to search. So that's where I usually go to first, uscode.house.gov. I'm there like every day. When I want to browse pages of the code, I need to see exactly how they are in print, that's when I'm going to go to the GPO's govinfo. One of the drawbacks, or maybe a feature or a bug of GPO's information, is that GPO's online edition will only be available after the print edition has come out. Remember how I said before that it's only printed every 6 years and supplemented annually? So if you need the absolute up-to-date version, you're probably going to have to use Office of the Law Revision Council's website as opposed to govinfo, because even online on govinfo, it's only up to date as far as they've actually printed it. And then, of course, I go to the law library's collection to find versions of the code from, before 1994. There's really not a lot of other free options out there for that. I don't want to leave this slide before talking about subscription services, such as Westlaw, Nexus, and Hein Online. These services can typically be accessed in a law library or an academic library. We, of course, have them in our reading room. The major benefit to using a subscription service is that they have really nice linking, comprehensive linking, so you can find additional resources that provide explanations or analysis, deepen your research. If you really have to do a big project and you're going to be using multiple resources and needing to see all different types of analysis, I wouldn't spend a lot of time on the free resources. I would try to use my time efficiently and use a subscription source if I could, because you're going to get a lot of benefits for a big project like that. Okay, we talk a little bit in this class about citations, just to make sure that you're all familiar with what you might be looking for if you ever see this, in the real world. So this slide shows you what a citation to the U.S. Code looks like. Lawyers use a legal citation style guide that's called the Blue Book. The whole title is called The Blue Book, A Uniform System of Citation. And if you've never heard of this, you're probably in a better place than me, because I've done a lot of blue booking work in my life. And it can be quite tedious, but this is the style guide that most lawyers default to when they're citing to material. A lot of legal publishers default to it too. And if you ever need a copy of the Blue Book, you can usually find one in a law library, or even most public library systems probably have a copy of it. So if you look at the citation, it identifies the title number, the information about the print version. Okay, so we're starting at, let me get my little pen out here so I can kind of follow along with you. There's the title, Title 29. It identifies which version the person wants to draw your attention to. So in this case, it's the U.S. Code. If it was a U.S. Code service or the U.S. Code annotated, one of these would be available here. It has a little section symbol. If you've never come across that, or if you've come across it and wondered what that is, it's just I call it a double S, or a section symbol. And then the section of the code that we're referring to. So in this case, the author of whatever you're reading wants you to go to 29 U.S.C. section 2611 to support the principle that they've cited in their work, right? This is the basis for their statement. And then you also should include the year of the code that you're using afterwards. And that's helpful for people, because changes are made over the years. Okay, so we're going to start our scenario. And as if you couldn't guess, like, I pretty much am going to work through the scenario, but follow along. And if you want to leave the WebEx and go to your own browser, that's fine too. So I'm going to read the issue out loud. Your client has sprained an ankle. She asks whether a sprained ankle is considered a serious health condition as defined in the requirements for leave in the Family and Medical Leave Act. FMLA, some people call it FEMLA, okay? She asks you to research this issue. So you've been given this little task. Find the section of the U.S. Code that provides a definition of serious health condition for the purposes of FEMLA. And then what is the title number and what is the section number? Okay, so how are we going to approach this? What do we know? We know the popular name of the law, right? Family and Medical Leave Act. We know we're looking for a definition, and we know that the phrase in question is serious health condition. Okay, so that's our 3 bits of information that we have. So based on our knowledge of the popular name of the law, one option is to use the popular name tool or the popular name table in the print edition. So this slide shows you what the results would look like if we use the popular name tool online on the Office of the Law Revision Council's website to look up the law called the Family and Medical Leave Act. It brought us to an entry, and I know it's a little small, but let me explain that. What we learned from the popular name tool is that FEMLA starts at Title 29, Section 2601. We have that right there. Sorry, my pen is a little thick. I wonder if I can change that to a thinner block. Pen, pencil, let's try that. And then so you know that it starts at Section 2601. Because of that et sequitur there, et sec, you know that there's probably more sections after that contain the whole law, that contain the whole Family and Medical Leave Act. So we can't tell from this information where the definition of serious health condition is going to be within all those sections. But it's a good start, because it probably gets us close to the section we need. Second, so say you didn't have the popular name, but you did know that the law you were looking for is in the labor title, okay? You basically just have an idea of where you're headed. You could use the browse feature of OLRC's online code, or the same way you would as if you were scanning through pages in a book. You would basically keep expanding the buttons on the left-hand menu to keep opening parts of the title with more and more granularity until you browse to the section that you thought might be relevant. The browsing method would probably get you close to the section you were looking for, but it might take a while, because you're basically having to keep scanning for what looks relevant. Third, another approach is you could think of your keywords and you could look up search terms based on what you know. So you're looking for a definition of a serious health condition. When we look up those words and phrases, definition, and then serious health condition in quotes, there's only a few results that we get from our search. So in this case, it looks like the third one, I've kind of looked at these. I think, okay, Title 5 deals with government organization and employees. That's probably not what I'm looking for. Title 29, Section 2601 is definitely heading close, but didn't really look like it would be relevant. And then here I see actually, like, just from the notes, I can see the term serious health, ... This is probably what I'm looking for. So I've narrowed it down, right? I don't have to keep browsing through a lot of sections. I've at least got 3 things. And say I couldn't tell at all from all these, I would only have to look at 3 sections to kind of see where I was at. I do have a question that came in. Let me just take a look at it for 1 second before I move on to the next slide. Let's see. The question is asking about whether the Blue Book requires adding the current's of Westlaw or Lexis resources when you don't have the print sources. I think to the person who asked me that question, I think I'm going to let's see, the question is, do you recommend that people use Lexis or Westlaw or go to the free source for GPO for writing law review articles? I don't really know if there's a benefit or drawback to that. I think the Blue Book citation style would handle both of those perfectly fine. I know that most people don't use the official version for when they write law review articles. That's kind of a very specific question. If you need more information about that to the person who asked, just send us a message after the class is over on Ask a Librarian. And then I had another question that came in about defining some terms like revised statutes, compiled statutes, consolidation. A lot of that information, those definitions are on the U.S. Code's website, uscode.house.gov. If you need to know more about the code and what it means to what revised statutes means and compiled statutes, we don't really get into that in this class. It's a little bit more in-depth than this class covers. Okay, so I had some questions. Thanks for bearing with me while I tried to get to them before I moved on. So let me just go back one step. So in this case, I've clicked on this definitions, and this is what it's opened. It's the code section that deals with definitions in the section of law that we're looking for in the entire chapter. So the FEMLA, the statute itself. There's a lot more definitions than I can fit on this page, and I try to make this as user-friendly as possible. So if you were looking at the results all the way down, keep going down, scrolling, you would see that the term serious health condition is defined as an illness, injury, impairment, or physical or mental condition that involves blah, blah, blah. There's the definition. So let's just jot down that citation. That's the answer to our question. We've confirmed it because we found the definition of serious health condition. So the citation that we're looking for that has the definition of serious health condition is 29 U.S.C. 2611. Let's talk about some other helpful information included in the code. So at the end of the text of a law, you're going to see some parentheses with a bunch of information in it. The parentheses at the end of a section contain a listing of all the public laws that contributed to that section. Remember how I said that the code is a compilation of, updates to laws that tells you what the law is at the present time? So in order to get to that time, we had to go through a lot of statutes, that were enacted that get us to where the code looks like today for this particular section. These are called source notes, also called source credits. Source credits can be used to find the history of a section of a code. So this example in the middle of the page, that's from our section, 29 U.S.C. section 2611 that we just got to the citation in the last question. This first law, that's the public law that created the code section. That's where it came from, the genesis. And then all the remaining citations that follow that, blah, 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 are subsequent amendments that might have changed something. All the subsequent amendments will be separated by a semicolon. So there's a semicolon there, a semicolon there. Sorry, I can't circle them all, but you get my point. And then in addition to the source credits that you find in the text of the law, after the text of the law, the code also contains separate notes about amendments. The amendments notes after each source credit show you where that law changed the section. So I'm going to elaborate on this a little further. So maybe you have a preview of the answer to this question already based on the slide that we just looked at. So here's a scenario again, the same scenario we've been working on, and we're researching this issue about the serious health condition. Has the U.S. Code section that we cited before ever been amended, and if so, in what way? So yeah, we know, right? There's those source credits that I was showing you in the 2 slides back. If there's more than one law, you know that at least some part of section 2611 was amended. But how do we know from this big kind of jumble of citations if our particular paragraph, paragraph 11, that had the definition for serious health condition, how do we know that it's been amended? So here's that amendment section, and I'm going to go to the next slide to show you the whole thing. Okay, so here's a screen grab of the whole thing. Underneath those source credits, you're going to see these amendment notes. These will explain how the section was amended over the years. And as we scan down the notes, each one is identified by year, and then which section was amended, and then by which law, and kind of a little note about how it was amended. So our paragraph in question is paragraph 11. I see paragraph 2, I see paragraph 14, 15, 16. If I scan down this whole list, I don't see any references to paragraph 11. So we can conclude that it doesn't appear from the source credits or the amendment notes that our paragraph in question, paragraph 11, has been amended since it was originally written in 1993. So as you may be already concluding from our discussion over the past couple of slides, new laws and amendments are being created all the time. You always want to make sure that you have the most up-to-date information. How do you do that? How do you make sure that you're looking at the most recent version of the code? Well, on the Office of the Law Revision Council's website, they have a tab for currency, and it will tell you how current the code is. So in this case, we can see that the code online on the Office of the Law Revision Council's website is current through December 23rd, 2020, up through Public Law 116-259. So that means that everything up through that public law, that date, has been inserted and incorporated into the code. I got a question, and I will talk about this for just a second. A good question. Does a section number of a code always correspond to paragraph numbers in a public law? I would say they rarely, if nearly never, correspond to paragraph numbers in a public law. Occasionally they will have the same layout, but I would say that's not very common. So you're not necessarily looking for the same section number of the U.S. code as you might in the public law. We're going to go into the kind of the anatomy of a public law in a little bit, but just so that you know, very, very rarely would those two numbers be the same. Going back to currency, so if you've checked to see how current you are, to make sure that no laws have been passed, since the code was updated, you can use Congress.gov and the House and Senate websites to check for legislative activity. So if currency is critical to your research, if you need to know the most current version of something, you should also check on a subscription service too, such as Westlaw or Nexus, because those services are updated very quickly. So kind of the moral of the story is if you need like up to the minute updates, you may want to use a subscription service. If that's not critical to your research or what you're trying to demonstrate, I would try using the Office of the Law Revision Council's website first. You can always see how far along they are into integrating the updates, and use Congress.gov as a supplement. The person who asked about whether a section number of a code corresponds to a paragraph number in a public law asked another question about what did it mean when I said we were looking for paragraph 11. If that wasn't clear, that was on this slide back here, which I just explained that there was a lot of definitions under the definition sections of 2611. The first definition number, paragraph 1, was commerce, and then 2 was something else, eligible employee, and then all the way down to paragraph 11 was serious health condition. So it was section 2611, paragraph 11. Sorry if that was a little confusing. And then back to updating, how do we make sure that you're looking at the current version of the print source if you're using a print source? If you're using an annotated print version of the code, you'll have to check the pocket parts in the back of the book. and then also the separately bound supplements. If you're using the official print version of the code, you'll need to check the annual update volumes at the end of the set. And then even then, you really should check an online source to make sure that your section hasn't been changed since the supplement was printed. So a lot of our currency now, I'm double checking that, is really reliant on online sources. Okay. I know I talk a little fast, but we do have a lot to cover. So I do apologize if I'm kind of speeding along here, but we're at our graphic again. Okay, here we are back at our original graphic that shows the publication process. We've moved through our discussion of the U.S. Code, and now we're going backwards to session laws and slip laws. Okay. Public laws are first printed individually by GPO shortly after they come out. And these single prints, these single law publications, they're called slip laws. But it's rare that you would see a slip law in today's setting. They're not as widely distributed as they used to be into libraries, and it's just not something that you would necessarily come across. So we're going to spend most of the lecture discussing what happens to these slip laws at the end of a session of Congress, which is that they get bound in one big hardback volume called the Statutes at Large. But to understand the Statutes at Large, it is helpful to know that theoretically, all these individual laws, Public Law 117-1, Public Law 117-2, those are all printed individually as a slip law at some point. So let me provide a little background information before we kind of dig into this slide. The major blocks of time in a Congress are measured in what's called sessions. Each session of Congress is 2 years long. So we just started a new session of Congress, right? We're currently in the 117th session of Congress. It just started last month. And that session will continue until January 2023. At the end of each session of Congress, all the individual laws published during that session are compiled in chronological order and bound in their entirety in print in something called the United States Statutes at Large. The Statutes at Large includes all the public laws, all the private laws, and presidential proclamations from a session of Congress. There's also a couple of other things thrown in there, but what we're focused on today is statutory law, right? Public laws. You might have noticed that I use the term public laws and private laws on the last slide. Most laws passed by Congress are public laws. They affect society as a whole. Occasionally, very, very infrequently nowadays, Congress passes something called a private law. This affects one person usually or a small group of people. Private laws typically deal with topics like immigration or military pensions. Private laws don't appear in the code because, like we said before, the code has only general and permanent laws. So private laws are not generally applicable. They don't get inserted into the code, but they are available in the Statutes at Large. So if you ever need to hunt down a private law, you would have to go to the Statutes at Large. And we get a lot of requests for private law, like hunting down private law, because they often come up in genealogy research, kind of not really a legal research area, but family genealogists are sometimes looking for the private law that perhaps enabled their relative to stay in the United States and not be removed for an immigration violation. That might have been dealt with in a private law. Okay, so we're talking about public laws right now. Let's go back to our research assignment. We're on the third part of the assignment, which is locate information about the public law that created 29 U.S.C. Section 2611, the section that we've been working with the whole time that dealt with definitions. And what is the law number? So going back to our graphic, that screen grab from before showing the source credits from the U.S. Code section, we can see, using those source credits, that the public law was public law number 103-3. Okay, I've highlighted the answer, right, because we're kind of doing this in a screen grab, not a real live demonstration. But we know it's the enacting law because it's the first law in the list. And it also contains all the information we would need to trace that statute. It contains the public law number, which is 103-3, the statutes at large volume and page over here, volume 107, page 7, and the date of enactment, February 5th, 1993. Okay. And then we're going to go right into question 4. Locate the information about the bill that gave rise to the above public law. What is that bill number? So for this question, we're going to use that information in the previous slide, that statutes at large citation, and we're going to take a look at that because that is what's going to contain a lot of information. So we're going to use that to answer this question. The statutes at large includes the text of the law as it was passed by Congress and a lot of extra information to help us understand the legislative and codification process. So here's a screenshot of that, the very first page of the public law we've been discussing, Public Law 103-3, right? And we can use the information on this page from the statutes at large to help us answer question number 4. In the top left-hand corner, you have the volume and page number for the statutes at large. So here we go. Volume is 107. In this case, it's page 6. Moving down, you have the date of enactment, February 3rd, 1993. And then they also give you the bill number of the bill that eventually became the public law. So there's your answer to question 4, right? HR stands for House of Representatives. So you know that the bill originated in the House as opposed to the Senate. And it was the first bill introduced in the House during that particular Congress, H.R. 1. We know from the next bit of information that the Congress was the 103rd Congress, right? So the bill that gave rise to our law was H.R. 1 from the 103rd Congress. When that bill was enacted, it became Public Law 103-3. Okay. Hopefully everyone's still with me. I know I'm kind of using my pencil to drive you through the slide, but of course, if you have any questions as we go along, just put them into chat. And then the final thing I want to point out is the short title. That's typically going to be provided right at the beginning of the text and also highlighted in the margin notes. So it draws your attention in 2 different places. Short title is how we've been referring to this law during the lecture. Family and Medical Leave Act is how most people would refer to it. Just quickly note that the full title of the bill is up here. Oops. And the whole thing, the formal title, is an act to grant family and temporary medical leave under certain circumstances. Okay? But we refer to it as Family and Medical Leave Act. Just as we discussed the Blue Book citation style for citations to the U.S. Code, I also want you to have a visual to take away from this lecture of what the Blue Book style for citing to a public law looks like. So let's run through this citation piece by piece. So the first thing you have is the title, Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. In this case, the short title includes the year, which is kind of convenient. I'll give you some information about what happens if that doesn't include the year in a second. Then after the title, you have the public law, abbreviation for public law. You have the number of the Congress, and then the sequential number, which tells you that you're looking for Public Law 103-3. And then you have the Statutes at Large citation, which is the volume of the statutes at large, the abbreviation STAT, which tells you that's the work that you're looking for, the statutes at large, and then 6 numbers is the page number. So 107 STAT 6. If your short title didn't include this year at the end, say they were just referring to it as the Family and Medical Leave Act, at the end of the citation, it will be helpful if you put the year in parentheses, 1990, 3. You can see I'm not a good writer on my screen during PowerPoint presentations, but you get the gist. After 107 stat 6 in parentheses, you would put the year. I did get a question: is short title equivalent to popular name or not necessarily? There can be more than one popular name, and then there's usually only one official short title. So sometimes a law could be known as 2 different things popularly, and it might be in that popular name table twice, but the official short title, if it was given one, there's usually only one of them. So the short title will be a popular name, but a popular name won't necessarily be a short title. Okay, so we're all about resources, right? Where are we going to find these statutes at large online? So this gives you something to take away in terms of suggested free and subscription sources for public laws. For free sites, right, we're going to go back to our old govinfo, right? That provides PDF copies of public laws from 1951 to the present, and in 2 different collections. So I just want to kind of point out that the statutes at large itself is in one collection, and then they have another collection that they call public laws. You can kind of think of that as their like online version of slip laws. So you can use either collection if you're from 1995 to the present, but statutes at large the whole collection goes from 1951 through the present, and then the present is kind of a bit of a misnomer because it really only goes to 2013 because they actually haven't published statutes at large since then. So like I said, GPO's website only mirrors the print version. If it hasn't been printed, it's not available online for GPO. So statutes at large haven't been printed after 2013, so it's not available online yet. And then the Law Library of Congress's collection picks up where the statutes at large collection leaves off on govinfo and gives you historical volumes of the statutes at large from 1789 to 1950. We also have a separate website called Century of Lawmaking, which covers the earliest time period, 1789 through 1875. Why you might want to use that is because it's nicely searchable as opposed to the second collection isn't as searchable. But if you're working through really historic material, I would try to use Century of Lawmaking first, and I'm going to show you some screen grabs from that in a second. And then Congress.gov provides PDFs of public laws from 1973 to the present. And as far as subscription services, you're seeing these names over and over again: Westlaw and Nexus Uni or Lexis Advanced, depending on which one your library subscribes to. Hein Online, and then another one that I'll mention, ProQuest Congressional. They have statutes at large, full run, and also a nice run of public laws from 1901 to the present. Really comprehensive database for that. We have that in the Law Library Reading Room too, and a lot of academic libraries have that. Let's walk through some of the free online sources of public laws. We're going to start with govinfo. So govinfo allows you to browse by category. So if we clicked on this button that I highlighted here, category, that would open up a menu of options to pick from. And if you were looking for federal laws, you would choose bills and statutes. And there's those 2, you can see, I know this is a little small, but you can see that there was those 2 resources that I talked about, public and private laws and statutes at large, the two access points for public laws in govinfo. And then, like I said, it would be rare to encounter a slip law in the wild in print, but online you can get them on GPO's govinfo under public and private laws. If you selected that statutes at large collection, you would see basically a series of expanding entries. I've tried to give you a screen grab here to illustrate that. Each entry lists the year of the volume, the Congress that it covers, a session of Congress, because usually there's one volume per year, and the statutes at large volume number. So you would click on these plus buttons to kind of ever expand the menus, to keep going narrower and narrower. Another feature on govinfo is the advanced search tab. That's kind of what I've highlighted here. You would use this to add some date limiters, choose a specific collection, or search a certain part of a document. So I have an example of where you might use this. If you say you only wanted to search public laws enacted between June 1st, 2000 and December 1st, 2000. You could use the advanced search to set that up in the beginning, and then you would only be searching like 6 months of the collection, which is a lot smaller. You'd probably get a lot fewer results. So we're always looking for more relevant results. So using limiters before we search is always a good way to do that. A third tab that is offered on govinfo is the citation tab. You would use that if you already had a specific citation to look up. So we had those couple of citations that we've been working with from back before, so 29 U.S.C, 2611. If you already knew that, you could use the citation feature. In this case, you could use, there's a bunch of collections here that you pick from. And then so once you pick the collection, it changes these menus down here. And those menus change to kind of suit whatever collection you picked, and then you kind of go down from there. So if you were looking for volume 107, you would open that up here, and then you could put the page number right there, and then execute your search. It will just automatically bring up a PDF. So very convenient if you already have the citation. And then I spoke a little bit about our historical collection, the library's personal collection, the library's public collection of statutes at large online. This is that resource that I said kind of fills the gap because govinfo doesn't start until 1951. So our collection has the statutes at large digitized from the earliest part of our country, 1789 through 1950. And what you do is you just select the Congress in which the public law was passed, and then you can download a full PDF of that volume. It can take a little while because these aren't small volumes, but they're also, once you play around in these menus, not only can you open up the whole volume in a PDF, but you can open up individual laws as well. So I encourage you to explore that and see, how you might use that for your own historical research. And I was talking about century of lawmaking before, right? So I know this website looks maybe like a little old-fashioned, and I don't know how I got this box over here. It must have been a remnant from one of my earlier slides that I forgot to delete and then didn't notice until I saw it here on the big screen. But this is what our database, Century of Lawmaking, looks like. And it contains the statutes at large from 1774 to 1875. So even though it looks a little old-fashioned, like it was created at the beginning of HTML, the information in this website is very, very robust. And a benefit that it has to the scanned collection is that it's keyword searchable. So there's a really nice page where you can search through different collections, and one of those collections is statutes at large, okay? All right. And our last category for discussion is bills and resolutions. Going back to our original graphic, we see that an enrolled version of a bill or resolution is the initial step in the publication process, right? We've talked about slip laws, we've talked about statutes at large, and we've talked about U.S. code. Now we're going all the way back to the first publication of a law after it's been enacted. That's called the enrolled bill. So you remember in question 4 when we identified the bill number HR1, that first piece of paper that the law was printed on in its final form, that's referred to as the enrolled bill. Where can we find the text of enrolled bills? Congress.gov is a product from the Library of Congress, and it's the official website for U.S. federal legislative information. It includes the text of bills and resolutions from 1989 to the present. It has bill summaries from the 1970s through the present. And it also has copies of the Congressional record from like the late 1950s to the present in PDF version. And it's broken up between daily edition and bound editions. If you needed to check the coverage information, you could check this page here. We're not going to visit that right now because I'm kind of going to push through our slides so we can answer some questions at the end. Just a little bit about searching Congress.gov. Searches are completed using the search box and drop-down menu at the top of the screen. Just note that Congress.gov includes a link to public laws, just like we've been talking about, which can help you find public laws by their bill numbers. And Congress.gov also includes a link to the Office of the Law Revision Council's website, right there. Oops. The website we were using earlier to look up the U.S. code. So it has some linkability to it. And if you kept scrolling down, this is obviously a static screen grab, but if you kept scrolling down, you would see that there's some very nice resources for learning about the legislative process. There's some legislative process videos and resources further down the page. The legislative process resources provide information for all ranges of experience, from beginner's guides to very more sophisticated House and Senate parliamentarian reports. So it kind of has something for everybody. And also there's a glossary which provides explanations of legislative terms. I use that glossary all the time. It's really helpful. I don't always know exactly what people are talking about when they say, when they use some sort of Latin term for adjournment or something like that. So that glossary has really been fantastic for me. And then there are some nice videos that we produced a couple of years ago explaining all the different steps of the legislative process through the enactment of a bill. There's nice video transcripts and a downloadable diagram. So very nice wealth of resources to use if you're interested in learning about the legislative process. I just want to briefly point out a few of the search functions on Congress.gov. So we're kind of going back to our example. I'm just using this to highlight how you could search for it. So here you see a screenshot as if I've just done a search, blanket search of legislation for the phrase Family and Medical Leave Act. In this case, it was Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. So I know this is a little small, but you can see that the menus on the left-hand side allow you to limit your results after you've executed the search. So you can limit it to particular Congress, to a chamber of origin, to a type of bill like resolution, bill, and also status of legislation, whether it's been enacted, how far along in the process it is. So in this example, we've limited our results to only legislation from the 103rd Congress, right there. And you would find that in this Show More box. And so when we executed our search, after we executed our search, we were able to narrow it down to just a couple of results, 44 results, which is a lot better than otherwise. And here, look. Here is what we were talking about this whole time. Now, other bills that mention the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993, they're also going to be returning your search results. But if you're looking for something specifically, you can usually scan down this list of results and find what you're looking for. Once you've opened a link to a specific bill, on the bill information page, you're going to find tabs across the middle for the bill summary, the text, and the action. So here, I'm kind of drawing your attention to these tabs in the middle. The summaries or written by the Congressional Research Service, one of our sister organizations within the library. After a bill is introduced, legislative analysts in the CRS will write a short summary that describes the measure's significant provisions. And then the text tab will lead you to the text of the bill and any previous versions of the bill as it was put forth during the legislative process. So you'll not only have the final version of a bill that eventually became law, but you might have every iteration of it as it was engrossed in the Senate, as it was received in the Senate, as it was engrossed in the House, introduced in the House, etc. The Actions tab I've kind of highlighted up here. That's going to give you a list of the legislative activity for the bill. So anytime there was a hearing, a report, a vote, or a floor debate, it usually defaults to major actions, which is usually called Actions Overview. But here I've selected all actions to show you, every type of action that was listed in this category. I like to use that because I like to see everything. And if there's a document that's been digitized and is available, you'll have a link to it related to that action. So here, the action that I'm kind of pointing you to is on February 4th, 1993, the bill passed the Senate, and then here's a link to the recorded vote. If there was a hearing and the hearing had been digitized, you would find a link to the hearing here. If there was a report that had been digitized that was affiliated with the bill, you would find that report here. Okay, I know we sped through that, right? Because we only have an hour together and I have a lot to cover. But at the end of the lecture, we have a couple of minutes for questions. Let me see if I can scan through the questions that came in during chat. I did get to most of them, I think, but let's see. This one says, how does one access data and reports that are supporting material when the debate about a proposed bill occurs? Okay, so that question came through, and actually, I think I addressed it. If you're using Congress.gov, you can use the All Actions tab to find links to materials related to the action. Otherwise, we have a nice research guide about legislative history, and you would probably have to resort to using a research guide and then a little bit of legislative history work if it wasn't on Congress.gov because it was too old. So I don't know, Barbara, if you could put the link to the legislative history research guide in our chat for people. Oh, actually, my colleague who's helping me do the presentation, she said she actually sent the asker the compiling a federal legislative history guide. So maybe if you could put it in the chat for everybody, that would be great, Barbara. I would totally appreciate that. And then let's see. Are there any legislative history sources available on various federal statutes on Congress or the LOC websites? I think we've kind of covered this at this point. There's I would check out this research guide that Barbara just kindly put into chat for you all. That gives you a really very, very comprehensive list of sources to use if you're doing legislative history research on your own. This class is a little bit too short for an in-depth kind of look at legislative history and a little kind of an advanced research topic. But you know what, I think we should probably think about adding that to our curriculum in the future so we can kind of address some of these more intense questions about legislative history. And I have another minute for questions, but I actually don't see any more questions in chat. If you joined late, and maybe you didn't get a full discussion of the U.S. Code and the statutes at large, I had a couple of questions asking about things I covered. Just ask for the slides at the end of the lecture using our Ask a Librarian feature. And once you get a copy of the slides, I think you'll understand, you know, what you might have missed from the lecture. I'm not going to go over questions from, you know, from things I've already pretty much covered. And then you'll also, if you can also get a link to the recording. I think that's going to be coming in an email after class. If you want to review the recording, you should be getting a link to that after class. Is that right, Barbara? I think so, yeah. And then also when you leave this program, which we're almost doing now. Sorry, Barbara. Did you just come in?
Yes, they'll be getting an email. If you don't get an email by next week, definitely let us know.
Okay, great. Thanks, Barbara. And when you leave the class today, you'll be asked to fill out an evaluation survey. I would appreciate it if you would. I hope you enjoyed your time here with me today. I love teaching this class. And if you ever have any questions about your research in the future, don't hesitate to reach out to us through Ask a Librarian. And please sign up for our other classes in the Legal Research Institute covering case law and regulations. The regulations one's a really good one too. Thanks, everybody.